Oh. Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Arden, and welcome to our stream of Axis Swords content. Sorry, I pressed just start on the stream without really being fully oriented there, but we're ready to go. So here's the deal. Just for various reasons, I'm a little behind on certain comics that I wanted to review, and a big chief among them list that has been piling up is X of Swords, of which there are many books that have come out since we last talked about the series, of which I have some is sitting in this big old stack here of floppies. And I did have to kind of catch up on a couple just through the digital edition, but I've read them all. I'm fully caught up, and now we're going to be too, at least until tomorrow when more X-Men comic books come out. But it had to be done sometime. Like, we have to kind of get through some of these, and honestly, broadly speaking, this event is awesome. It does everything right in an event. And maybe people are going to disagree out there. Maybe other people aren't going to feel the same way. Personally, I was blown away by the quality of this book. There's a lot of fun stuff on the whole, ranging from an expansive event with villains that are interesting and fun, who I hope stick around in the future. We'll talk more about that as we get more into this event, because like the first chunk of Axis Swords is all about exploring them. There's some interesting details to the characters we're focusing on, but even just like the characters we're focusing on in general are all characters I really like. So it's a strong series so far because we have like magic, Wolverine, but then weird characters like Doug and Warlock working together, the Braddock twins. It's a very cool mix, each kind of from different series. Now that we've seen a huge chunk of this event take place, I really have to say it's strong on the whole. And we'll get into the specifics of it with more spoilers in just a bit, but I want to give a general review at first, like we usually do these days. And there's some variability in these, and you really don't need to read all 22 parts to get a general sense of this story. It's very piecemeal, although I think if anything's required, it's like the core books, like the X-Men core series, and the random books like one we'll be reviewing today. It's called Stasis. Those are pretty important in establishing larger things, but otherwise you can just kind of continue with the X-Men series you like. And it definitely is a tone change, focusing on different characters for most of these series, but it's really great. Tevye Smoka, thanks for joining us. He's saying this event, in my opinion, feels way too long. I disagree. If anything, I was a little surprised because by the end of this review, we'll be at part 16 of 22. So there's 6 left. And I mean, there's a lot coming out. It's a mile a minute, but I don't think it, like, for example, we're going to review 2 Marauders books that are entirely skippable, but were some of my favorite parts of the event so far. So it's very much an interesting mix like that, but I don't really think it asks too much of the reader. It's got some cool ideas going on, and my hope is that its its goal seems to be adding much more to X-Men canon in an already cram jam-packed era filled with content and villains and worlds and ideas. That seems to be the extent of this story, is just to really get people familiar with the new otherworld as it currently exists, and maybe gearing us up for some substantial changes in terms of characters and stuff like that. I don't know. We'll have to see, but so far I give this series a solid recommend. It's been fun and interesting. I like all the different realms of other worlds being explored. I like the 10 characters we're focusing on from the Krakoan side, but also their opponents on the Arakko side of this big tournament that's basically deciding the fate of the world. Brandon Walton, thanks for joining us. I'm doing well, but and I'm eager to kind of dive into all these X-Men books and really catch up on some of them some of the thoughts that I've been stewing on. We're also going to kind of check in on some series we haven't talked about yet, but I'll get into that in a little bit. But yeah, like I said, I really like both teams in this tournament. They're both filled with interesting characters. Some we're very familiar with, some are completely new, and they're all cool. And like I said, I hope they stick around. The Arakko is an interesting place. We've learned the history of this world, some of its characters from it. It's like a very dark version of the X-Men that doesn't feel overly dreary or anything like that. So there's no reason for them to go, but we'll have to see how this all ends. So far, it ain't going well for the X-Men, but we'll get into that. Tevi says at least this event is weekly. Well, if it was monthly, it would take like well over a year for sure. And there is a lot to it. I think that is to a degree its fault, but it is rushing. Like we really only get into the tournament around issue like I guess 14 of 22. No, more 15 of 22. And everything before that is all set up, which normally I would fault in a big event. And the only but first of all, as we've seen the shape of the tournament, I understand why they did that. We'll get into that as we get to that point in all these books. But I think also there's like a certain design to all of this where like the goal is more like House of X. House of X is like the actual event isn't full of like big action scenes. It has those moments just like X's Swords, but by and large the goal of House of X is just to usher in this new age of X-Men. And X's Swords really just feels like a second wave of that, which is baffling but amazing. So let's start talking about these books a little bit, and because I want to kind of give a sense of some things, but we also are going to talk about some other stuff that is kind of outside of X of Swords, because the next one in our little reading order that I've been going, like, because we've reviewed every X of Swords book so far, so the next one up is Hellions number 5. But Hellions is a series I haven't talked about yet. So I have been reading it though. I happen to have Hellions number 2 here. Somewhere I think in that box is Hellions number 1. I didn't really feel the need to take it out. And then I have read 3 and 4 digitally. So I know this series. I just haven't had a real occasion to talk about it yet. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about this newer, kind of real wild card series in the like family of X-Men titles right now, because Hellions is all about murdering X-Men or murdering mutants, I should say, mutants who have killed or are actively murderers in some way, that are all kind of dangerous and basically break the most basic law of Krakoa, that you can't be harming humans or really other mutants, and they constantly do that anyways. Among them, and kind of the star of the series, if I am, or at least what I feel, a huge part of this series, I should say, is Havoc, who's been affected by something and seems to be going through some sort of weird darkness. Along with that are a bunch of fun little random characters like Orphan Maker, a sort of sentinel-ish being that has a nanny bot, and they're both dangerous. Empath, who can control people really viciously, and he's like just like this little sociopathic kid. Grey Crow and Wild Childs, who are just kind of standard like violent characters that are like not really interested in, I don't know, they have a set personality sort of thing. And then they're all kind of co-opted and led by Mr. Sinister, and there's captain of the team, who is Psylocke. And for those that don't know, because it took me a while to, or like to fully understand what they were getting at, or I'd like appreciate it, because I'm not really familiar with the Excalibur series, which I guess is where I assume this is covered or something. But basically, Psylocke is now just a hand ninja, and Betsy Braddock is her older self, is the kind of idea, which is pretty cool. And so Psylocke kind of feels like she belongs on this team now, because she's had that older identity wiped clean, and she is just this ninja, similarly kind of seeing if they can seek this path of redemption. And the first issue of Hellions is really worth reading if you want to find out whether or not the series is worth your time, or like for you, because it's all about like Nightcrawler kind of persuades the Quiet Council, the leadership of the mutant race on Earth, to form this little team of murderers, because their alternative would be to do what they did to Sabretooth and other villains they consider beyond redemption, which is just to bury them in the ground of Krakoa for an indeterminate period of time until they decide otherwise, because they're just too dangerous and won't play ball. So like they just have to do that, and Kurt considers that barbaric and unconscionable. So it's some interesting stuff. And I like the first story arc. It's all about them seeking out this old lab that Sinister used to run to make clones. And he's like, oh, you gotta destroy it because it's like a loose end I don't want to deal with. And they end up encountering Madeline Pryor, who sort of confirms something has happened to Havoc, Cyclops' brother, for those who don't know. Karsten Logan, great to see as always. And they all sort of, or no, sorry, she kind of isn't able to determine what's wrong with Havoc. No one really can seem to figure it out or glean what's happened to him, but he seems horribly disturbed and will like black out and kill people. So something like that kind of happens with Madeline Pryor, but it ends up getting resolved. And the first story arc is fun. It's written by Zeb Wells. It's got some cool art, and I really like the characters because it's just such a weird and different team from everything else. So book number 4 ends, and that leads us right into X of Swords, which otherwise the Hellions haven't had nothing to do with yet, because they've sort of been off establishing themselves up until now, very much like X Factor. So it seems like the more newer series are much more kind of ingrained into the plot of X of Swords, as opposed to a book like New Mutants, where we just kind of zero in on the affected characters and ignore like the series sort of detours just for a moment for X of Swords. Hellions, it seems like, oh, there's like a whole little story arc going on here because their second mission is basically dealing with X of Swords. Now, the premonition that Saturnine sent to the X-Men, telling them who were their champions, did not include a single Hellion. Surprise, surprise. Oh, my thumbnail is in my giant slideshow of stuff here. I can get rid of that because that's just bothering me. Just gonna move that over here. There we go. Carson says, it's weird that people hate mutants, but they don't hate the Fantastic Four in Marvel Comics. Well, I think it's a bit of a caveat in fiction, but I think people get it wrong, too. Fantastic Four had something happen to them, so it's not like that can spread. And there is some prejudice going on there, but I think there is a it really just comes down to the arbitrary nature of how these superheroes get their powers. And sure, it's like, oh, that doesn't make sense, but skin color don't make sense. If that, like, I guess people can be like, well, there's a visual aspect to it. It's like, sure, but like that used to apply to Italians and Irish and Jewish people like myself, actually, until kind of around after World War II, society just decided that those people qualified as white, and it didn't matter anymore. So that discrimination existed, though. It was a big deal when John F. Kennedy was elected president because he was Catholic. But stuff matters. And so I think people will hold it against the X-Men, and it's not actually a huge stretch to say that they would just be randomly and consistently discriminated against by a group of humans, perhaps out of tradition. They've been building robots to kill mutants for a long time now. I don't know. That literally just came out of me in response to your thing there, Karsten. I've just thought that before. I just sort of was in response to what you said. So it's an interesting thought. Let's just put it that way. I'm not like patting myself on the back there. It's just like, oh, like I never really like that's not something I had thought of before. I'm bringing up now. It's like, no, I don't know. The second you said that, I just was like, no, that's very easy for me to believe. Maybe just where my perspective is after these books. It's kind of interesting, though, I will say. X of Swords, it doesn't really care about that. It is about Hickman's personal preferences for big, crazy stories with alternate universes, this cataclysmic darkness that you have to face, wild ideas of fantasy and factions and different imagery that feels evocative of stuff that he did from Time Runs Out, with like Doctor Strange's crazy army from that time period. It just reminds me of that stuff with like the armies of Araco, which we'll get into. And I think that's part and parcel of just what Alan Hickman's about, and him infusing that with X-Men stuff, which by the way fits because all this otherworld business with Captain Britain Corps, like that's nothing new. We knew about all of that stuff, so it's pretty good. And by the way, I should have said this maybe earlier as a little warning. Like, we're obviously venturing into spoiler territory now, but more importantly, we have a lot of books to talk about. This is going to be a very long stream, without a doubt. I'm going to probably, like, kind of go in and out of detail to a degree, but I digress. So Hellions number 5 begins with Empath being revived after he basically got himself killed by Grey Crow on the last mission. The details of that murder are genuinely hilarious, and it gets into how Empath was just like messing around with Grey Crow, and in response he just shot him in the head. And gradually Empath has to figure that out after he's been revived, which is great fun. Then there's a bunch of debate about in the Quiet Council because obviously this tournament's been announced and they don't know what, like, they're not happy about any of this. The fate of this island and the Earth, which we'll get into detail a bit more later of, like, but it's all really just hanging in the balance of this tournament, and the Quiet Council has no control over that. So eventually Sinister comes up with this plan to basically go into like the various realms, try and find the swords to use not by the Krakoans, who are all actively hunting down their own swords at this moment, but the swords for the Araco, because they all need to find the 10 people involved in the tournament, and they need 10 swords too in order to also participate in the tournament. So the Hellions kind of begin this mission to try and stop them from achieving that. We'll get into that in a second, but I will say, meanwhile, we are still getting our little guided tour of Otherworld as it currently stands, and we learn about Dryador, a kingdom that has completely been conquered by Araco and the armies of Amenth, which is like this demonic horde that apparently rules them and has like corrupted all of Apocalypse's children. We're going to learn a lot more about them, but this is our first little taste of that, and it's well established. And one of my favorite parts of the X of Swords is just how much detail and thought is put into these villains, if you can even call them that. They're so interesting as characters and stuff. But they've already conquered a realm basically opposite of Avalon, I believe, that links to Araco. So it's fascinating stuff. They all are kind of co-opted into the mission, but the Quiet Council has an interesting caveat to that and insists that Mr. Sinister goes with them this time. He wasn't part of the last mission, he was just ordering them around. And he gets very frustrated with that and creates a clone of himself, and then the two of them argue about who has to go into the, like, on the mission. And they ultimately agree to do 2 out of 3, rock, paper, scissors. I love that. It's a little comedic moment. It's very, like, kind of the sort of things Zeb Wells has done in a lot of these X-Men books. But it's a funny conversation, and it works. Because that's Mr. Sinister for you. It's like, no, the clone isn't just going to accept, oh, I'm the second copy. It's like, no, you're just some clone too, obviously. So why do you get to stay here and I have to go on this dangerous mission? And the only way they resolve it is rock, paper, scissors. Khalil Frederick says, out of curiosity, have you been keeping up with Strange Academy? I kind of find it odd watching Magic and Scarlet Witch work at the same school with how Wanda is regarded on Krakoa. You know, I have read the first book of Strange Academy, and I like the general premise of the school. I wasn't aware of that. Kalila says, does make me want to see an awkward teacher lounge scene with the two. That would be cool. I wonder if, what's his name, Scotty Young might be reluctant to do that because he's not part of the X-Men family, and he just sort of leaves that in the background. Maybe that's the kind of thing that, you know, those conversations probably do happen off-panel and off-page, right? That's the kind of thing that can easily exist in your headcanon, for example. Karsten Logan says, I got a Spider-Man question. Why do you think Mr. Jameson tells lies about Spider-Man, but he did like the superior Spider-Man? Honestly, there's nothing more to that than Dan Slott kind of just making a joke that Jonah always hated Spider-Man, even though we, as the reader, always knew Spider-Man was a good person. But when Spider-Man was secretly a bad person, all of a sudden Jonah liked him. It does also kind of get into Jonah's character a little bit, the authoritarian nature of Superior Spider-Man. I don't really mean that politically, I just mean he had all those little cameras spying on everybody. Appeals to someone like Jonah, who, like, basically is responsible for the creation of the first Spider Slayer. You know, Mr. DC Comics, you make a great point. You say X of Swords reminds me of Mortal Kombat. There's a lot of similarities there from the nature of Mortal Kombat's like overall plot idea of there being these tournaments that dictate whether or not a realm can win out over another. I will say, and hey, it's cool you're here at another Marvel stream, by the way. Um, when we get to the actual tournament, it is nothing like a Mortal Kombat competition. Karsten, thanks for joining us again for a temporary amount of time. And just a little amused because you do that before. So next up is a little guide of Avalon. Uh, Even casual Marvel fans should know a little bit about Avalon. That's the realm connected to our world and kind of the opposite of Dryador, like I was saying. So it's most closely connected to Earth, and it's the home of the Jamie Braddock, brother of the original, or as we know him, Captain Britain, and also where what's her face, Betsy Braddock, like is operating and stuff. And I'm sure there's a lot more details about all of that in Excalibur, but Excalibur I'm horribly behind on, and it's kind of my one hole of knowledge. Although I will say, having that, like not having a complete knowledge of every single X-Men book that's come out since House of X, actually kind of helps inform my opinion as a reviewer. I feel, just in the sense of like, I don't feel I need to have read all of those books, and I still understand the broad strokes of what's happening across X of Swords. Uh, so it's not like it's a huge continuity-driven nightmare. And like I said, I don't think you need to have read like all of X of Swords even, let alone all of the X-Men books that have come out over like the last year and a half. That would be a lot to ask of people, and I don't think it quite gets in that direction. Certainly if you've read everything like in that reading order that they've been putting out since House of X, you probably can appreciate some of this stuff a little better. But broadly speaking, it's easy enough to follow and pretty fun. And then Hellions pretty much ends with the team going into Avalon and setting out on their mission. They have an interesting conversation with Jamie, who has is going to be very heavily involved throughout this story. But this is our first little flavor of him. Tevia says, okay, well, let's go in order. Oh, did I miss something? No? Oh, okay. Tevye says, Saturnine cheats. We'll get into that, but it is kind of interesting. She's the host of this tournament, but does not feel like a neutral party at all. Yet I can't help but feel she's playing a sort of longer game and recognizes the threat that is Araco, which in no way resembles Earth in terms of Earth being a threat to her. Earth doesn't feel like a threat to her at all, but Araco does. So I'm she's a character worth paying attention to as we get into like the final act of X of Swords. But let's get into more of the middle. Next we get into New Mutants number 13. The series that I only know a bit about. I've read like the first couple of issues, but I'm very behind on like the bulk of the series. But the broad strokes of it I quite like, because the X-Men line, kind of as it currently exists, presents an interesting buffet of opportunities for fans. You have brand new teams like the Hellions, or you have New Mutants, who are like basically the exact team they were from before, with Magic and Cypher and Warlock, who are like the three characters we focus on in this book. But all the other major characters in the world of New Mutants are very much a part of this story. But this book's all focusing on Doug, kind of accepting that Warlock is his sword, and he is very much part of the tournament. He also has to convince Krakoa to let him go. This is a good example of what I was saying about, like, I'm not caught up with New Mutants at all, but I just picked it up right here, and it's a good read. Ed Brisson, Rod Reese, write and he do the artwork respectively. And it's a wonderfully vivid series that just focuses in on these handful of characters. While an interesting thing happens, and the background information in X of Swords starts to give us information on the swords themselves. The first one we learn about is Ilyana Rasputin's, which is her soul sword and has always been a part of her identity, like for as long as she's been magic. So it's an easy one to start off with, but we'll learn about pretty much most other swords, I believe, if not all of them, involved in this tournament, and they all have their own little history. They're all and properties and powers, which is pretty interesting. And really left me thinking, like, okay, we're gonna get into like a real tournament with all of these different swords and mutants with different powers. And I was wrong. We'll get into more of that later. We also are still learning about the domains of Otherworld, the last few that we haven't covered. Hot Hive is one of them. It's like an industrial insectoid colony. And there isn't a lot of like big moments in this book other than just these characters coming to terms with them going. Exodus shows up and insists like I should wield Warlock and go. Even Krakoa kinds of agrees, but he eventually gets the island, the sentient island, to assent, even though the island very much values Doug. He's really the only way that he can easily communicate with the rest of the mutant race currently because they can't translate his speech. Only Doug with his mutant powers can. In so many ways, he's one of the most important mutants of all. So for him to go to Otherworld, the one place in like the multiverse where if he dies, they might not be able to bring him back, that's a huge risk that the island very much doesn't want to take. And that's the whole thrust of the conflict of this issue. Just this weird story between a man and a sentient island, and the sentient island just having trouble letting go of this person and letting him do something that he feels he needs to do. But he explains himself, and ultimately the island accepts this, gives his blessing, and he joins the circle. At which point there are four: Storm, Wolverine, Magic, Doug, oh, and I guess Warlock. So technically five, but four participants ready to go. Then we dive into Excalibur, another series I haven't talked about, but unfortunately this is the one I know the least about. I actually have a digital copy of the first trade, but I haven't worked my way through it yet. I haven't even touched it yet, to be honest. But I know at least a bit about Captain Britain. Teva, you were saying in chat that you don't know anything about them. I know a little bit about like their magic and how they're defenders of reality. I feel Axis Swords does an excellent job of teaching me more of this stuff, though. I know a lot more now, and I like how Betsy Braddock has kind of returned to her normal self as she was before. They did the whole body swap thing with her body that's been that way for the majority of her time as a character. It's a new direction for her, but also really eases tension that a lot of people had with her character. Tension I understand, and it's a nice way to preserve her character. It's not like either copy got erased. So fans of Psylocke, as they know her, she's still around and is going in this different dark direction, but fans of Betsy, as they know her, is in a fully realized character, like working with her brother to lead some form of what lives of Captain Britain. And an interesting caveat of this is I knew the Captain Britain Corps was destroyed, but I didn't really know the details. It's very much from the events of Time Runs Out. So Hickman's kind of following up on that stuff, and I guess it had been pretty much untouched since then, which I found fascinating. So Hickman's kind of coming into this and sort of leading it in a new direction that I feel works. And this book's all about that. It explains a lot, but it also gets into the revelation that like the prophecy was kind of weird, but as we find out across this book, Saturnine's like romantically interested in Betsy's brother Brian, who is was the original Captain Britain and now becomes Captain Avalon over the course of the story. Saturnine tries to make a deal with him, but he ultimately agrees to participate on the tournament, like in the tournament with the X-Men. Kind of rejecting her romantic advances, all the while like Jamie's kind of like scheming and stuff. And it's an interesting book that really sets out to show us like an interesting side to the Captain Britain Corps and their avenue into things. And they come into the tournament adding two people all at once, and all of a sudden we are pumping the gas on these characters sort of getting into this tournament. I didn't know much about Captain Britain. Like I said, I didn't know anything about Excalibur, but I have to say, Tinny Howard, R.B. Silva, the writer and artist for this one, Nolan Woodard doing the coloring, they do a really good job at sort of at teaching me things and getting me into this. We learned about their swords. One is the Sword of Might, which was like the sword used as part of whether or not members were chosen to join the ranks of Captain Britain. We learn a lot more about how those members are recruited and details about that I honestly didn't know. So that's pretty interesting. And then there's like a whole like romantic scheme going on in the Citadel with Saturnine and Jamie Braddock that ultimately leads to a version of Jubilee being killed just for Jamie to prove a point. And regardless, it's also a good way to set up the Braddocks joining the tournament. I also really like how Brian is depicted in this book. He isn't a mutant, and even as early as X Factor, like the third book in X's Swords, Beast was commenting that he wasn't sure what that meant and whether or not Brian would be willing to join the tournament. So seeing why he does, it's a cool little brother-sister moment, and really had me excited for them going into it. We'll talk about where that resolves, but it's interesting. Darsh Chingaso says, I've been loving X of Swords. It's been fun and surprising. I agree. And as we're going forward, there's a lot of twists along the way that I really didn't see coming. Because, like I said, I was really excited to see how Betsy and Brian were going to be in this tournament and thought they were going to be a big part of this. I was wrong. Well, so far, but it's very surprising, and I have no idea where their story's going, even with like 6 issues left. I don't know what the shape of those 6 issues are. I know they're barreling through the rounds of this tournament, so we'll see. Khalil says, not gonna lie, and I know a lot of people have brought it up, but Saturnine looking so much like Emma is kind of odd to me. I don't think it's intentional. I wish there was something they did to her design to do that. It doesn't bother me because the way Saturnine kind of carries herself, even though they have similar personalities, like Emma's never had that level of power. So that kind of works. But yeah, like just a little something. More colored hair, different colored eyes, or something just to make her a little more otherworldly, like even pointy ears. Just something probably would have helped. It's interesting that people have been talking about that because I haven't really been following a lot of other people's feedback. I have heard some things, and most people do like this on the critical side of things. I know that. But anyways, then we move into our next book, and it's a heavyweight because it's Core Series X-Men number 13. And we go on basically to our next tournament participant, Apocalypse. And it's just so cool that, like, I would argue the protagonist of this story is Apocalypse. So much of this is about his history, and he kind of spurred the events of the tournament to take place in general. We open on him still just like teetering on the brink of life and death, just based on their initial contact with Araco. And we learn a little bit more about how it kind of just affirms what we had already learned, that a long time ago, Krakoa lived as this united land with Araco called Dokara. Apocalypse had this whole family of people, and they were approached by these demons led by this being called Amenth. And the demons say, like, came with this helmet, and basically the helmet, well, okay, we don't know much about it yet, but one of the demons puts it on, and a voice speaks to them through it, saying that they want to view them through their true eyes. And it's made apparent that this is the war that split the land apart, and that they had to divide the world in two so that they could prevent the demon, like this horde of demons controlled by this Amenth being, from overtaking all of Earth and the mutant race, but also the human race, really. And we don't see much more of that yet, but we do see a little flash of Iska the Unbeaten, who was Apocalypse's wife's sister. So like I said, he had a whole family. So he had a wife, and so his sister-in-law betrayed them, and that apparently led to the fall and split of the land, and Apocalypse being separated from his family. Although we don't know the exact details of that separation still, like even up to this point, and it seems like a particularly important plot point for the overall arc of X's Swords. Regardless, Apocalypse gets up, having survived a risky healing maneuver attempted by his fellow mutants to recover him in the present day. We learn about a sword called Scarab. once wielded by Apocalypse long ago to, I guess, fight this demon horde. But when the land was separated and that war ended, he broke the sword and buried it somewhere in the western Egypt in the Libyan desert, and I guess probably the pyramid where he first awakened. And he comes across it, like its pieces, forges it into a new blade, with Gorgon accompanying him, and he's like, Gorgon says, "Oh, it looks like a short blade," and all the Apocalypse says is that it is. Now watch me wield it. We don't see him go to the circle, but there's our eighth member, the biggest heavy hitter of them all, and don't worry, we learn a lot more about that stuff, because initially I was like, oh, it's kind of really vague, but they're just gearing us up. Stasis, kind of a special Alexis Swords book, is up next, and it is probably one of the most important ones of what we're going to talk about next. I certainly hope so. It's co-written by Hickman and Howard. It's a really cool one where we learn a lot more about the different... well, first of all, we get a glimpse of the realms as they currently stand. They all get an invitation to join Saturnine at the Citadel. We see Pestilence and Famine, I believe. The current rulers of Dryador. The folks at Avalon are there. The mysterious guys that never talk from a place called Mercador that was just, like, randomly conquered are there. They don't say nothing. And they're, like, dealing with contract disputes and stuff like that. But the Araco leaders speak and say, no, we burned that realm of Dryador down. It belongs to Araco now, which in turn belongs to Amenth, and thus it is all ours. And Saturnine is pretty blasé about that. I don't think she really cares about the well-being of these realms. They're all kind of in a constant state of war and flux, as we learn. Like, the Merlins and Roma's realm are like split in two after they came into conflict, one being kind of technology, the other being of Fae. We get a little sense of all of that stuff, but it's really, like I said, I get the sense a lot of this stuff is just introducing us to it so we can go back there and explore some of the stuff more in the future. You know, I might have missed a part along the way here. Yeah, so we'll cover that before the next one, I guess. 12, 13, yeah. I skipped Cable, but I'll veer back to it after I cover Stasis. It's not important because it's all about the tournament people gathering anyways. And we know... oh, okay, so that last X-Men book was Apocalypse is the 10th. Cable joined and Gorgon with him, Apocalypse, so they're all ready to go. And meanwhile, Araco is gathering their swords and their own men. Unlike the... Krakoan circle, which is composed of like Rockslide's older body, just like in a way to remember that version of him, and it was created in a nice little moment by Polaris. The Arakan circle is made out of bodies, and it's a really gruesome sight. We know a few of these swordsmen already. We have our 4 horsemen: War, Pestilence, Famine, and Death. Like, we don't know them specifically, but we know Apocalypse's style, and those are his original children. We will learn more about them as time goes on. We also know the High Summoner, who's actually, I believe, one of their daughters. Like, the High Summoner is a child of one of them, the one with the flaming head. I get the different ones mixed up. But anyways, regardless, they all prepare to go forth. They approach one of them, Red Root, who is the guardian and like sort of equivalent to Doug, that sort of speaks through Araco's like nature, and agrees to go and participate in the tournament. Pog, the giant crocodile feller that anyone who's seen the previews of Exosaurus will surely recognize, is recruited. He seems mostly like a mercenary and is just bought over by Jules and the promise of bloodshed. They recruit some brutal, mysterious person, Bay the Blood Moon, and she doesn't say much but agrees to go without much fanfare. They also recruit someone that we'll learn a little bit more of, but I'll just say it here. Because he reveals a lot of it at this point. He's a very interesting character, and his name is the White Sword. And the idea is he just fights Arakan demons on the on that realm endlessly. And every day he just resurrects his warriors and they fight these demons all over and just battle against the endless hordes. And he actually hates the Arakans because they're all part of immense armies and stuff, but does agree to participate in their tournament and on the condition that he can ask them anything, and if they win the tournament, it is his. They also recruit Iska, the Unbeaten, the sister of Apocalypse's wife, who betrayed them all to begin with, and is on their side now. So, like one after the another, they're recruiting their members. We've also met Stalin, who Wolverine dealt with earlier, and seems to be some sort of criminal and a bit of a pariah among the Arakans, but also very popular among their general people. He's an interesting figure. So they are gathering their numbers, and we're learning more about them. They're all very interesting characters, like with their own history. It's not like they're all a unified front, the way, like, they're no different than Krakoa, where there's different factions. Some view others as villains and heroes, and they all have their own history and, like, bitterness and love towards each other in different ways. They're a cool group. And with that, we have all our people gathering. But I did forget to mention one, and I will quickly divert back to that, because it was a digital one, so I missed it in my little stack of books here. And that's Cable. Cable is, of course, the one participant of the tournament we haven't really talked about yet, but he was an obvious one from the beginning, since his series is also new, and the whole first story arc was about him getting a sword. We haven't reviewed the last issue of that first story arc, but basically it's just about him kind of coming into ownership of that sword and dealing with those crazy robots that were attacking him. He does ultimately defeat them through some pretty fun maneuvering. Basically, and it's a cool moment because we learn a really important piece of information through it. Cable realizes that these robots have called in reinforcements and they're just going to surround him, but the robot arm he got from his older self, like before he killed him, doesn't contain a time-traveling device, but rather a nuclear bomb. And he uses that to trick and destroy these aliens who originally had possession of the sword. The book also gets into the details of those aliens, and it's all pretty interesting. You can check it out for yourself. It's by Jerry Duggan, and he's one of my favorite writers and one of my favorite comic book lines across X-Men right now. So he does a great job with it. And then we get into book number 5, which kind of follows up on what we were introduced to earlier in X of Swords, where Cable is joined by his parents, Jean and Cyclops. Oh, I forgot. But so the whole thing about that nuclear device, though, is that means, and we are outright confirmed this, the older Cable knew he was going to be killed by the younger Cable and put that nuclear bomb in his arm. Which makes me very much think the older Cable was kind of planning for all of this and may not actually really be dead. But I digress. The Summers family go to the sword outpost up in space, as they are instructed to do by Saturnine for some reason. Cable plugs his sword into the base's power thing, and they discover invaders from one of the realms. I believe that Mercador one, where they're just these strange beings that just wiped out this entire contingent of sword agents. And remember, those guys are not weak. They are the space equivalent of S.H.I.E.L.D. back when, S.H.I.E.L.D. was a thing. And they are a very cool enemy threat that we only really get a glimpse of before the Summers are able to work together and destroy the portal. But they are powerful, had insane numbers coming in through the portal. Like, Jean kind of got a glimpse through it and just said, oh, this is their only chance to do it. And Mercator is like this dark place of decay where nothing should be able to survive. And yet this drove of insectoid beings exists and appeared to have assimilated the crew on this space station. And they're able to close out the portal with no idea about what it means. But it reinforces what I was saying about, I don't think that alien threat we're introduced to in the Cable book is going to be followed up on in X of Swords. Doesn't mean it's not going to be followed up on ever. It's just, to me, it's, proof solid that they're just introducing things here. All this other world stuff, yeah, there's going to be a resolution around this tournament and stuff, but broadly speaking, we are just dealing with stuff that is going to be followed up on in the future, like so much of these X-Men comics to date. And I understand people's frustration with that because it is a lot of build up and set off and all that stuff. But when they pay off this stuff, it's usually pretty good. As long as they don't rush through it, like as long as they don't rush through the rest of X of Swords, then I am on board. And we get a good exploration of these things. But for me, and a good example of that is like one solid example of payoff we got was the tie-in between Empire and X-Men. We got this crazy fun adventure where they had like these zombie mutants on Krakoa, and then the horticulture showed up. They were introduced much earlier in the X-Men comic books. So it's the sort of fun payoff that you can have, like introduce new threats that could be followed up on again and be something in the future. This really isn't the end all be all of anything. We're just kind of getting started, and it makes me feel like a lot of these Arakko characters we've been introduced to so far are very much like our future in terms of what we can expect out of the X-Men. I really do think these characters are not just one-offs for this story, and I hope they aren't. They're interesting enough. Like some of their names are tough and not quite as memorable as I'd prefer, but their designs are amazing and their history is very interesting, and I think they have some staying power. And I'll talk about what my vision is for X of Swords after these books, but that's just a vision, and I really don't know what's going to happen after that because I think it's very unpredictable and interesting. And with that, we have the first 11 books of X of Swords covered, going back quite a few streams now. I do have to say it's nothing that I've predicted so far. I really thought like it was going to involve some of that Russia stuff or maybe some of the stuff with vampires. Nope. That gets into what I was saying about like X of Swords is just the beginning. Like it's not the end all be all of anything X-Men. Certainly isn't the end of Resurrection long term or anything like that. It's all just wild out there, and that's pretty cool. Thanks for joining us in chat there, Gabriel. Always good to have people participating and stuff like that. And so yeah, with that we still have quite a few more books, but not as many. We're catching up to present day at this point, and now we really get into the tournament. And it is halfway through, and I was a little reluctant, and even then it's still taking its time. Because X-Men number 14 is next. So it was an interesting moment where the halfway point basically consisted of X-Men number 13, followed by X of Swords Stasis, and X-Men number 14. All books largely written by Hickman, all so good at kind of bringing it all together and really getting me excited about some of this stuff. Gabriel is saying he wants to see Mad Jim Jasper's powers. He's the ruler of the Broken Market, I believe is what it's called, one of the realms of Otherworld, and he is an interesting character. We'll see a little bit more of him shortly, and he's cool. But first, one of my favorite books out of this entire event so far. We open on beautifully drawn stuff by Linnell Yu, where Apocalypse is now on the Starlight Citadel, kind of sitting and thinking to himself, and he's approached by a menth. I don't know if it's been fully revealed yet. I don't know, it must have, because it's her. And that is his wife, Genesis. So she has an interesting story to tell, and I believe it begins here. So we know that the world got split in two between Okara. One half on Earth became Krakoa, the other half became Arakko. For reasons still, the one last piece of the puzzle we still don't know. For whatever reason, Apocalypse stayed behind on Earth. Genesis and their children all went to Arakko, basically to hold out and fight for as long as they could against the endless demon hordes, knowing full well they probably stood no chance long term. They built these... Well, okay, the first thing that happened was 1/10 of their population, because they were with like thousands and hundreds of mutants. Hundreds of them just went insane and ran off into the wilderness, where there's like all these bodies just horribly crucified by demons, and they just ran off. The rest of the mutants built these amazing towers that just slaughtered the demons when they came, and for a while they actually kind of flourished. And we see like one of Apocalypse's children mothering the High Summoner, and they did have one of their mutants predict doom and gloom, but kind of ignored him because they couldn't believe it, and even in response they just went out into the world of Arakko and just started killing demons thinking that they could. they all made it all the way to where the ivory spire had already been set up, and the white sword, like he had just like been religiously fighting demons for hundreds of years by that point, and didn't really care much about his fellow mutant race, and basically turned them back, treating them as attackers and forcing them to go back to the mutant cities. There, on their return, Genesis found her sister Ithka waiting for her. They already knew she had kind of fallen to the demon horde, but agreed to parley and go with her to Immense Throne. And there, Genesis did battle with this ruler and cut off the being's head. So she won in a way, but they revealed, well, if you kill Amenth, you just have to wear that helmet because it's the only thing that can kill this demon horde. And she refused and resisted for a while at tremendous cost to her people, who were just slaughtered by this uncontrollable horde. Meanwhile, I should mention, she also realized how hopeless her mission was going there, because while she thought she had been like holding the demons at bay, they were really just biding their time all these years and created this massive army out of those mutants that fled into the wilderness when Arakko originally arrived, like breeding them with demons. So Arakko's horde just consists of these descendants of the mutant race experimented on with demonic DNA and created into this insane endless army that's just only controlled by Apocalypse's wife, and who has become corrupted by it fully, as she says, and she just wants to conquer and destroy Earth as much as the helmet does now. And she says she will. She views her husband as weak at this point. She says, look at the people you side with. What happened to your philosophy of the strongest survive and all of that stuff? We know about Krakoa. We've been spying on it through the High Summoner all along, while he's been feeding you false information, which we knew, but it's so devastating to realize how much they had on Apocalypse at this point in the X-Men and how behind they were. And it really highlights the threat of this demon horde. And I don't know what the plan is. I really don't think this ends with Genesis living, but someone's got to wear that helmet. And part of me wonders if that person will be in Savanur or something, but I don't know. Or maybe that helmet will be destroyed or something. But regardless, next up. So I said X-Men number 14 was my favorite of X of Swords so far. And that was true when I read it. But I think my absolute favorite has to be kind of in between these two Marauders books here. Because next up are Marauders 14 and 15. They're back to back, which is an interesting move. But it makes a lot of sense. It wouldn't really work any other way. And Marauders is still one of my favorite of all the X-Men series right now. Because it's always so interesting. It dealt with Kitty Pryde up until now, but now the focus is entirely on Storm. And actually, these books zero in on Wolverine, too. And Jerry Duggan does a great job of that, because he bounces around with Wolverine a lot. And Ben Percy co-wrote it, actually, now that I'm looking at the credits. So it makes even more sense, because Percy is in charge of the Wolverine series, and it's very much tied into all of that. So all of the two sides of the tournament are basically forcibly put into a little meet and greet together by Saturnine. And they kind of are introduced to each other, though we don't exactly know it yet. As I know now, a lot of it is the people that will have to face each other meeting each other, though even they're not quite aware of that. They've been given vague prophecies in the form of tarot cards, but they only tell us so much. Some prophesize tragedy, some I don't think it's really saying much at all, beyond just oh, your journey's still ahead of you kind of thing, beyond X of Swords. But this is where I think we best get to know some of these new Arakko characters, just seeing them in this social situation and how they react. Magic and Gorgon go up to Ithka and say, they say you can't lose any tournament or game, and they drop their glasses in front of her. Oh, actually, no, that hasn't happened yet, but she says, they want to find out if she's left-handed or right-handed, so they both drop their glasses, and she catches them both at equal speed, and they realize she's ambidextrous, and they're like, oh, of course we should have guessed. But then she's like, now it's your turn, and she just lets go of the glasses, and magic creates a little portal, and the cups fall into the two mutants' hands, and they say, "Oh, we didn't spill a drop either," because she was able to catch it without a drop. And it's a neat moment where it's not like these new villains are like way beyond the X-Men in terms of power and stuff like that. Ithka's actually impressed with them and says this tournament will be interesting, and I really liked that. Um, Meanwhile, in the most fascinating moment in this book, Storm gets to know Death, and she has a dance with him. And because of the magical nature of like otherworld and stuff, they go like underwater while they're dancing. It's one of the most interesting moments because they're also talking, and Storm talks about how Death has been with her since her childhood, which is true, and she is very comfortable, like holding her ground with this horseman, and they have a real chemistry with each other. That's cool. I would say the most fascinating part of this big X-Men crossover event is a dance that like even though this comic doesn't have any music, it's well established using like just you see a woman playing a harp, and then like the whole dance starts. They start to like get together and talk to each other, and then they plunge underwater, like not even being affected by it because of the magic. They spin around and then like get into this giant clam, and it lifts them up out of the water. It's very like almost romantic and fancy, but like fascinating and just like a really intriguing moment where it's like, oh, this Death is interesting. He's not just some mindless goon. He has a personality, and Storm kind of sets boundaries with him in an interesting way. Meanwhile, Logan's pretty clearly planning something, though he doesn't notice one of the horsemen quietly poisons some of his food because he's too busy deciding to end this tournament early, and he stabs Saturnine right through the guts. And that's how this first book ends. And the next one follows right up with that. Same creative team behind it, basically. And we open, and I thought for a sec, this book, these guys had me. Because it opens with a little bit of text, and it's like, no way, we just skipped over all of this. Because it's like, Logan murdered Saturnine. A three-way battle between the forces of Saturnine, Krakoa, and Arakko set the Citadel plummeting from the clouds. Magic managed to save the mutants, but the gate was closed, and Arakko was able to basically invade unchallenged into Earth. They slaughtered mutants, including like Moira, who became brain dead, so basically she can't reset the timeline. And then they talk about how, like, with the mutants fallen, the Avengers, Fantastic Four, Asgard, they all fought and lost. And Wolverine just watched as Earth fell to bloodshed. And we open on Logan just crucified, tied to a post, that we had seen in the earlier days of Arakko. And Saturnine actually comes up behind him and is like, well, it's fair play, like, if you're gonna stab me, I should stab you. And she gets Wolverine's claws like just erupt from her hands, and she stabs him. And then all of a sudden, he's just right back in the banquet hall, and he's like, "Oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't do that." And he backs down, and it's clearly like she senses or knew what he was gonna do, and showed him this vision of like, "This is what's gonna happen if you try and not play by my rules." And it's an interesting moment because Saturnine, like, she wants to be with Captain Britain, but she also clearly, well, Captain Avalon now, and she also clearly has her own motivations. She's, I think, benefiting the X-Men to a degree by setting up this tournament, as she kind of implies with that vision, but she's not exactly pleased that Logan just tried to kill her, and is pretty aggressive with them in certain ways, and is setting her own terms to this tournament in every way. It's fascinating. Meanwhile, Doug decides to have a sample of some of the, fortunately poisoning himself because he ate the poison bit of it, and he starts to die because I think it's pestilence that does this. And Saturnine's basically like, well, you just tried to kill me, so I'm totally fine with that. Ithka, meanwhile, is like, well, she's pretty cool about it, and stabs him in the throat so that he opens up his airway so he can still breathe, but he's still like being overwhelmed by this poison. But the White Sword is furious, and he's like, this is a moment of parley between us before the tournament officially begins. I will not be party to this dishonorable act of poison. He walks up to the guy and heals him. So he heals Doug. He's like, so Cypher, Sword of Krakoa, you owe me nothing. We are even. Like, I'm just making things right after that disgusting breach of honor in his eyes. And like gets into what I was saying, like the Iraqians are not all unified. Apocalypse says nothing. He just stares down his wife for a moment and just says, I see you did well with the children. And she replies, I did my best. This is my favorite book out of X of Swords because it has so many fun little character bits for both sides of this tournament, really establishing certain things. Brian kind of comes up and challenges Saturnine. It's a fun moment where she freezes time for them, and he tries to get her to forfeit the tournament because of their actions, but then she tells them about what Wolverine did, and she's like, yeah, I'm not going to do anything, and he basically backs down because he's like, oh, I can't say much about that. The banquet begins, and they serve some sort of sacred beetle, and Death, who's got like an Anubis kind of helmet that he wears and seems to have a real fascination with beetles, can't handle it. He literally goes like this and doesn't say anything. Like, he goes having a mental breakdown at the thought of it. And the servant that brought out the dish for him and is like putting a beetle on his plate is just like destroyed with his mind and just turns into ash. And but Logan just grabs it off his plate and eats it in front of him in a taunting move. It's quite something. Here, I need to check this because it's bugging me. So, okay, War is the mother, I believe, of the High Summoner. Death is the Anubis fellow. And I don't know which one Pestilence and Famine are. But it's hard to keep the Four Horsemen intact. But they're all really well-written characters, each distinct in their identity and visual style, which I quite like. And that's pretty much it. There's more games and like characters getting to know each other. We also get Mad Jim Jasper's odds of survival for each of the mutants and participants in the battle. Cable, Cypher, Red Root all have like long odds of surviving this tournament, while the best odds go to Annihilation, so what Genesis was, but Amenth basically. Apocalypse has pretty good odds, but not as good as hers. Iska has Iska has the best odds of surviving because she has never lost any game. And we see an example of that when Cable and Magic decide to challenge her again, but this time just with any game they can think of. So like they do pin the tail on the donkey with Pog, and like try and do a balancing act game with glasses. She can do it all. She's able to like they did one of those games where like you have a little like I think it's a bullet hiding under a cup, and they start spinning around the cups with like 6 different cups, and she's able to tell easily where it is. And then Magic, my favorite one, Magic says, guess what number I'm thinking of? Ithka says, you're not thinking of a number. And Magic is like, amazing! And I just thought that was so funny. Like, she just can't lose. And Cable says, I am not looking forward to fighting you. And she says, you might live to a ripe old age after all. That is a wise opinion to have. These characters are so great. I really like them. And with that, the tournament begins with our first round. And we learn that each round is going to take place in these different realms of Otherworld. So it really reinforces us learning about the different realms as we've gone along in the first half of this storyline. That helps. And the first one's going to take place at Avalon. The realm we already know the most about because we've seen it like in comics far before House of X came out, and its general identity has been unchanged. And it's Betsy Braddock versus Ithka the Unbeaten in a fight to the death. And with that, we go into the next Excalibur book, which is fascinating. And I haven't really had to have my digital books in front of me, but I have the option to go there. We'll see if I need it. But the thing about it is, we open on this big Coliseum. Jamie Braddock, like King of Avalon's there. He's like, all right, like, let's begin the tournament. It dives in pretty heavily. Maybe I'll answer. Bena Amantho says, have you played Marvel's Avengers games? Thoughts on it if you have. I haven't, because I haven't really been overly convinced about good things. My friend Dylan, who has been on videos here before, has played the demo and liked it. I don't know if he bought the full game. The thing is, when I was buying like the Spider-Man game, it's on for $80 still. I'm not paying $80 for that based on what I've heard, but I will eventually get it for a more reasonable price and then go from there. That's $80 Canadian, so that might be different in other countries, but yeah, it doesn't. I heard it compared to Anthem, and I'm not into those kind of games, so I will get it on a cheaper price. Let's leave it at that. um, but I haven't heard like maybe it's got more to it. I don't know. That's just secondhand information, so I can't really speak to it personally. Let's put it that way. Um, yeah. So Excalibur begins, and I was thinking like at that point there was 8 books left in this series, in this little like storyline or whatever you want to call it. And it's like, wow, for 10 competitions, like, that's a lot to cram in there. And I would have hoped a little breathing room for this storyline to have a real ending. But Excalibur really pictures it, or like paints it in a very different way from what I thought it would be. Because we open and Betsy squares off with Ithka. They have that big tournament thing going around. And in a single blow, like, Ithka shatters her. And she has a sword called Mercy. So it's a very interesting moment. And Betsy just shatters into a million pieces. And there's like a little like extra page that talks about how the citizens of Avalon are baffled by it, but it appears that like Betsy lost the first round and Iraq was up by a point right out of the way, like it, just like that. And if she's dead, like she can't easily be brought back necessarily, but it's a weird death and not very pronounced. And they're like, oh, we don't like they don't even really get time to mourn before the next tournament begins like immediately. And they have to derail in spite of like Storm being like, well, we don't even get a chance to like react to this or anything like that. The answer being basically no. I'm gonna have to put this book in front of me because I need to correctly know exactly how the next part happens, because it's interesting. Okay, yeah. So the next round begins, and it's gonna be Bay, one of the Bay the Blood Moon, one of the Arakiel, is their correct name, combatants that we actually know the least about, and Cypher. By far the character in this whole tournament that everyone has looked down on the least. Or the most, I should say, because he's like the most combat inexperienced. He doesn't really have powers beyond just being able to effectively communicate well with his sword, and his sword is sentient and part of like the phalanx, so it's not like he's totally weak, but everyone's kind of been downplaying him. A huge part of that New Mutants book was Magic just trying to train up Doug a little bit to be more effective, like as a participant in this tournament. But Saturnine says like, oh well, like come along with me. And the old she says to the rest of the combatants like, you'll see your friends again, but the two of them are going to be changed and will be irrevocably different as a result of this, and we'll see how things go. And they start to like give them a makeover, basically. Well, we don't know what's happening to Babe, but they're doing that to Doug. Like they put a little crown of flowers on his head and they're dressing him up. And Magic goes with him because they've kind of been partnered up because they're both from the same series, so it makes a lot of sense. And they have a really interesting back and forth with each other. It's insane this book is part of Excalibur because Betsy's just wiped out from this. And Brian was like outraged appropriately and insanely upset, but there wasn't really anything he can do about it. And yet, like the series or like the book diverts into this stuff, and they ultimately are led to a wedding ceremony, where Doug is apparently to be wed to Bay, and she's kind of interesting because when she speaks to him, he can't understand her, but he fascinates her. And he asks Apocalypse, like, do you understand her? And he's like, she's making good vows to you. She says, like, love is a fealty that cannot be broken. I will love you with the force of a wave that crashes the shore and fight for you like the current that swallows the sand. And Apocalypse is like, these are good vows, Douglas. Like, you should accept them. And so they get married. It's a very strange moment. And but they pull off the veil, and like Doug seems to have a real connection with the woman, and they basically get married. But meanwhile, Jubilee, the non-Captain Britain Corps version, was like contacted by Betsy right before like she went into her tournament, and then Betsy just disappeared, apparently dead. And so she attacks with Shogur, Jubilee's daughter / dragon. And the dragon's actually able to destroy reality with its fire breath, I guess. This seems like something I'm missing from Excalibur or such. But Saturnine in response is just like, oh, that dragon's a child, and just like begins dominating its mind and rewriting its like psyche with her magic. And she's like, oh, cool, I got a dragon pet. And Jubilee is just powerless, and Storm has to like save her because the dragon just abandons her in midair and apparently doesn't care about her anymore. But regardless, she's like, well, cool, we got a dragon, and these two got married. It's a point for each side, because you both win, and all of a sudden I understand why the tournament is only going to take a relatively small portion of this storyline, because even though it's called X of Swords, and it's been about getting these swords, and those swords are still relevant, like in terms of setting up certain plot lines, not all of these characters are going to be required to use them as part of the tournament. And not all of these rounds are straight combat. And that's where it's truly different from Mortal Kombat. Because our first round was a traditional battle. It ended in a heartbeat. Our second round was a wedding. And with that, we go into round 3, which starts with us here on Wolverine number 7. Now, we've been enjoying Wolverine's series so far, and Ben Percy returns to write this one. And actually, it doesn't start with his round, though, I should say. Magic goes up against Pog or Pog, and they encounter each other, actually kind of at first in the Holy Republic of Fae, but almost immediately they divert to the floating kingdom of Roma Regina, so like a realm of fairies and stuff like that. Magic and Pog are eager to fight off, like, and battle each other, and they quickly clash swords. But Saturnine appears before them and says, "Oh, it's not a fight. Like, every round so far seems to be different." And she says, "This is a contest of arms." Literally, it's an arm wrestling competition. And because of that, Magic handedly loses, because Pog has these giant stone arms, and powerful as Magic may be, she is decimated. And with that, our score is Araco 3, Krakoa 1. And then we get into Wolverine's book. So Wolverine's competition is fascinating. This is a test of death. And him and the High Summoner are teleported to a realm called Blightspoke, which is where realities go to die and decay. And they're basically told to, like, fight to the death, but the competition is really just, like, who can survive the longest, as, like, their flesh and psyche and magical essence decays around them, because Blightspoke just destroys all elements of their reality. It's a fascinating fight where, like, we cut to, like, part of their fighting with, like, part of their flesh going down. They'll fall into another reality and suddenly battling in space. There is a straight up, like, direct, full reference to Tron. Because keep in mind, Marvel is owned by Disney, which also owns Tron rights. So we see Wolverine dressed in, like, Tron colors with a full suit, and his sword has become, like, a cybernetic style sword. And the High Summoner has similar outfit. I think High Summoner looks more like Tron, and Wolverine looks like that character from Tron Legacy, and High Summoner creates, like, these virus-like beings. And that's just, like, a part of a panel, a part of this page, before we then, like, cut to them being two pieces on a literal chessboard fighting each other. This fight is insane, and one of the coolest, until ultimately, after great effort, Wolverine is able to impale the High Summoner in the head. And then he kind of staggers for a little bit and falls over, but I believe that character is straight up dead. But unfortunately, this was, as Saturnine puts it, she said it was a fight to the death, and Summoner fought to the death, and the point goes to Araco. And Logan is furious as the score becomes Araco 4, Krakoa 1. It's fascinating. And Logan is then, and this part is where this is where I get, like, I don't know what the plan is, where we're going from here, but it is a real mystery. Logan is transported to the, like, a bar in the Broken Market, and is told that he and Storm are to have a drinking contest. And the two of them talk about it, and they're like, this is weird. So no matter what happens, Krakoa gets a point, which is very much the case. And they start to get really drunk because it's crazy broken market alcohol, and they have a real moment of where they almost like kiss and stuff. But it's interesting dialogue. It's just clear like the alcohol is affecting them, and they've always had that chemistry. But meanwhile, at the Starlight Citadel, Saturday, now accompanied by her, well, Shogo, her dragon, I guess, has Solem and War battling each other. Oh, so it is War who's the mother of High Summoner, I believe. And she says, just as Krakoa fights Arako, so does Arako fight itself. And she says, the reason for this is because you are not all a unified land. You are a nation. Like, you have conflicts within yourselves, and now you must express that. Wolverine and Storm were doing that in the form of a drinking contest. Now Solem and War have to do that. And she chose them because they have a particular beef, as Solem killed her husband a long time ago, but Solem also says, "Oh, I have other plans," and at his request, Wolverine is teleported right in front of them, and he says, "Well, you owe me because I helped you get the Muramasa blade, which he did in the previous issue, and now you're going to fight War on my behalf." And he just sort of jumps off of the arena. And Saturnine is okay with that, given that Wolverine tried to kill her, and she's like, you will all pay for that in your own way. Meanwhile, Wolverine's healing factor isn't working right, and you can tell that because he's still completely horribly drunk from the drinking contest. And with that, he has to battle Wolverine, and their War is quick to fight Logan because he just killed her son. And she gets a couple of good hits in, but Logan is just barely able to cut off her hand. And as Saturnine put it, the first to lose an appendage in this fight is the winner of this particular round. So Wolverine wins, but of course he was doing so on behalf of Solem, so the point goes to Arako. And Logan says, well, someone pull this sword out of my neck, with me cutting out a word from that dialogue. And it's a brilliant ending to the issue. And also a pretty overwhelming lead for Arako at this point. They only have to win one more round, and then they basically have this tournament in the bag out of 10 rounds. So, and we've covered 7 already. Like, in just a few issues, they really, well, really 2 issues, we cover a lot of ground really quick. So the tournament, as hyped up as it was to be, like, it really isn't a huge part of the story. It's much more about these Arako characters, the X-Men kind of dealing with a whole new legion of threats, more stuff being introduced, especially around the dynamics of Otherworld, that very much feel like, oh, like this is stuff going forward as much as it is the story present. And I don't feel unsatisfied with what we've gotten overall, but this tournament is fascinating and not remotely what I expected it to be, even as recently as going into like Excalibur number whatever, part 15 of this thing. So like just 2 issues ago, Excalibur number 14. Did not expect any of that, from Betsy's apparent death to Doug getting married to that Bay woman, and even just the weird dynamics of this Wolverine book with the drinking contest. I like how Solem's favor to Wolverine got paid off right away. That was pretty interesting to me. And it gets into what I was saying earlier in the stream, where I genuinely have no idea where this story is going from here. And that's a really cool place for an event comic to be. And I think that's what's so great about this, is like doesn't really feel gimmicky. It feels like it's 22 parts because there's so much story they want to tell. I like how we're focusing on weird and different characters, including a whole bunch of new things. And as far as the future goes, we've spent so much time introducing these Arako characters that I desperately hope this story ends in unification. It seems to be sort of the quiet theme going on here about Krakoa and Arako coming back together into Okara. I really think that's going to take place in some form or another. What I'm curious about is what's going to happen with that helmet and Ament and all of that stuff. Will Apocalypse ultimately have to leave like Krakoa and leave this demon horde in place of his wife? It feels like they're going to have to be stopped, because otherwise we're stuck with like nothing in terms of like it's made very clear from the Marauders books, if they lose this tournament, Arakko will decimate Earth. So I'm so curious about what's going to happen next. And it does seem like Saturnine is playing some sort of long game. As much as you said, like, in this last Wolverine book, well, you're going to pay for trying to kill me, and each of the you participants are going to have to pay in some way for that. I think she isn't exactly pro Arakko either. Like I said earlier in the stream, it doesn't seem so sided in that direction. Bad Mr. Box, thanks for joining us. Yeah, I think we'll leave it at there. That's a long bit of talking for my part, but it was good to catch up on some X-Men books. And I have to say, much earlier in this stream, where is it? Darth Chingaso said, I've been loving X's Swords. It's been fun and surprising. I'm going to echo that thought as kind of my closing statement about this. I've been really loving this event too. You compare it even to something that I like, such as death metal, and it's still stronger because it's just so interesting and thought out. Death metal's just kind of throwing Batman evil versions out at whatever rapid pace they can, but Hickman and his fellow co-writers have so carefully constructed a story here, featuring like all these different worlds that have kind of changed from what we knew of other worlds back in the day, and they have a very clear vision of all this stuff, along with amazing new characters that I so desperately want to join up with Krakoa and become part of the new that reality. From Solem to Apocalypse's Four Horsemen to even like the random ones such as White Sword. He was really cool and has this sense of honor. I really want him to stick around. And then ones that I think have kind of been played out, because like High Summoner, who's that sort of imagery has been around since time runs out and has been kind of toyed with for some time, I think is straight up dead at this point. So it's not like they're all just gonna live through this unchanged. And Apocalypse said, like, oh, we should expect sacrifices after Betsy died. But it seems like not all of these competitions are straight fights to the death or anything like that. So it's very curious. And there's only 3 rounds left. So I don't know what's on the horizon. But I do know the books. Next up is X-Force. We still have to pay off Hellions. Because I don't know, they went off to sabotage Arakko, but it seems like those demon guys got all their swords and stuff, so I don't know what the dealio is there. We'll find out how their mission went, I guess. Cable is after that, and then X-Men number 15, Excalibur number 15, and then X's Swords Destruction to end it all. So, Destruction is quite the statement, too, for it to be the final name of the issue. But I really do hope we get more of something out of all of this, because there's so much interesting stuff going on. And if not, well, it might affect my overall view of these things, but until that time, I really enjoyed the ride. Bill says, hopefully we get to follow up the stuff with Storm, T'Challa, and Wakanda as a whole. I feel like they have... you mean that was set up in X of Swords. I feel like they will. It's the same thing with Russia, or the random aliens that Cable and Cyclops and Jean Grey fought on the Sword Outpost in this story. There's no way they're going to have enough time to deal with that stuff now, but it wasn't introduced for no reason either. And I'm okay with that, because so much is being explored here in X of Swords in a satisfactory way, that I guess it's okay to be also setting up things in the future. Gabriel says death metal just needs to be over with already. It's dragging way too long. I agree. If it had run in a similar time period comparable to like Empire, because I didn't feel like Empire was rushed out too much, but it went at a pretty brisk pace and it was over and done with pretty quickly. But I didn't like Empire that much. But if death metal went at that pace, I'd probably be much more interested in death metal. As it stands, I'm much less like, oh, I got like eager to be reading those books every week, and just I'm ready for it to wrap up and move on, because it's getting a little repetitive to a degree. I'm glad they did all these times to really fully explore all these things, but we've reached the point where like it would have been nice to have wrapped things up by now, especially if they just even did a few more books in a shorter period of time. That would have been nice. Yeah, not really dealing with comments on my appearance right now. They're not negative, so it's all good. I just don't feel like talking about that. I obviously just haven't been shaven, and it's nice of you guys to say. I'm just, that feels like an unnecessary distraction. But I do agree with what you were saying, Gabriel, for sure. Bad Mr. Box says, it sure feels like Mad Jasper is pulling the strings. This whole thing feels like his thing rather than something Saturnyne would do. I disagree. I mean, you could be right. I'm not going by any specific information. The impression I got, though, was that Jasper is more of like her underling and is doing all these things on her behalf because he knows there's profit to be made working with someone that powerful and with that much magic. The Ninja Genko says 3 Jokers felt rushed. Oh, I have more to say about 3 Jokers. We'll do a whole stream on that, don't worry. Gabriel says it seems Mad Jane Jaspers is the main ace card when needed. I mean, that's interesting. Like I said, I'm going by nothing more than my impression of things. You could be right, and that's an interesting thought. But I really just think he's very willing to work with her, unlike some of the other rulers in the realms of Avalon, because he knows it benefits him for so many reasons to do that. And he strikes me as the kind of guy who is always making and willing to make a deal as long as it benefits him, which is cool. Thanks for dropping in, Adrian, even just for a little bit. And Gabriel says, yeah, I'd agree if it did it in the way of death metal. Yeah, I was saying that earlier. If X of Swords is dragged out death metal style, it would be a real nightmare. So they are going at a good pace. The only downside is real, like, you're not on top of that or have your comic book store, like, ordering all these books for you, like I generally do. It's easy to get swamped and fall behind. Like, in a few short weeks, we were that many books behind that it's easy to justify this hour-and-a-half long stream. With that in mind, though, I think we are going to end things there. My voice is getting tired. And we've talked a lot about these X-Men books for now, and more are coming out tomorrow, so there'll be time to talk about more anyways in the future. And I am so fascinated about what happens next. Khalil says, I really wish Nightcrawler was one of the people chosen to fight. You know, you'd think so, because he's certainly wielded a sword before. I thought, Colossus was going to be more of a story, because he was kind of part of the path to X of Swords. I kind of think it's interesting they chose a lot of non-traditional characters, and not necessarily every normal sword wielder, like Doug as Cypher, for example, who's never done that before. It's kind of cool. But it is interesting, yeah, that Nightcrawler would have been cool. I'm sure there's more, characters I'm not thinking of off the top of my head that are, sword wielders. Psylocke to a degree, but she is also involved, just not the other Psylocke. And, yeah. Okay, Bad Mr. Box says, Saturnyne never had powers like she has here, as far as I remember. Jim Jaspers, on the other hand, you might be just using her for his entertainment. Oh, I see what you guys are getting at. Well, that's an interesting theory. But I don't know. I kind of got the impression Saturnyne sort of came into power because of the collapse of Captain Britain Corps and a lack of, other infrastructure in place to account for order, and she just sort of accrued power through that, basically leeching off of what was once the Captain Britain Corps source of power. But I'm not entirely sure. I'm not a total expert on that stuff pre-House of X at this point, so there could be details to all that I am not privy to, and maybe a connection I'm not making there. But yeah, I think we'll leave it at that. So thanks a lot for joining me, guys, and we'll see you next time here on Comic Island.